And part three, looking at Hitler's consolidation of rule and organization of the state. And so here we do a little bit of examination of the process that we have discussed previously. And your learning outcomes. You've seen them before. We round them out. After 33 and Hitler is named chancellor, he has attained the goal of essentially leading the country, and with the Enabling Act, he concentrates power in his hand. And then, of course, we have the creation of a single party state. But it's not, he doesn't have complete control. And one of the things that he has to do, despite, say, the legal, quote unquote, legal things he's done, is win over the conservative elements. And so what follows is an examination of some of the things that he did to essentially get some of the powerful members of the society to agree with him and to further consolidate his rule over the country. In examining the Night of Long Knives, one of the things you have to look at is why. Obviously, he wants to consolidate his rule, but what was he really worried about? So one of the most important things was that the radicals were not under Hitler's control. And they were a threat to his plans. Having assumed leadership of the country through legal means, or through using the political system of the Weimar Republic, he couldn't really have this upstart group in there that had different beliefs, so to speak. And he also wants to make sure that he is the unquestioned leader of the Nazis and that everybody owes their allegiance to him. The SA were extremely violent. If you recall, they started out as a Freikorps group that existed to protect the Nazi meetings and to go and bust heads, essentially, and were very much involved in the street violence of the tumultuous years. And this worried a number of the different groups that Hitler had curried favor with. And of course, Rome is calling for a Nazi revolution, the second revolution mentioned in the previous video. And what he wanted to do was extend the purview of the SA and absorb the German army. So the SA, again, was 2.5 million people strong. It was populated largely by former servicemen, former members of the military, and essentially Rome wanted to have the SA become the revolutionary army of the Nazi state, very much like the Red Army of the Soviet Union. And Rome also believed that the Nazification of Germany was moving too slowly. Hitler is moving through these through the established channels. Yes, he's totally disrupting the state, but he's moving through channels that are already established, and this was too slow for Rome. He wanted a straight up revolution. And he didn't agree with Hitler's slow step-by-step movement through this revolutionary process. So in essence, Rome was calling for a revolution that was socialist-based, in which the workers and the soldiers would run society and break up the privilege that the elites enjoyed in German society. Hitler, on the other hand, wanted support from those elites and especially was worried about upsetting the army. All right. And so he needed the support of the army, and the army was worried about protecting their position in society, and the SA threatened that. And one of the biggest things, of course, is Hitler wanted to become president after Hindenburg died. Seriously, dude. It was no secret that Hindenburg wasn't gonna make it. It was nearing the end, and of course, this means that there's going to be some sort of struggle for ultimate power, and the army acted as one of the uh, main prongs within German society, and of course, the elites, right? And so he wanted to make sure that they were there to back him. And then the other thing is, okay, what had happened was the army set out these fake orders, essentially indicating that Rome was planning a coup. And Hitler uses this, of course, and says that Rome is planning a coup against him. And this allows Hitler to move against Rome. And basically, if this coup had happened, which pretty much it wouldn't, then this would tie him too closely to the SA to be able to gain full support from the elites within society. So, either he sides with the SA or he could crush the SA with army support, and then this would allow him to gradually extend his influence over the army and take over one of the traditional institutions of the country. And I can't say enough, this is an institution which has been respected for an extremely long time. And as we know, these institutions, like the army, provide a stabilizing factor that could potentially turn against Hitler later if it's not neutralized. And the SA and the army hated each other. The army perceived Hitler as a moderate. Oh no, that's a kind of funny one. As a moderate, but Hitler and the Nazi Party had the traditional aspects, that is, the kind of authoritarian ideas and like nationalism that the army respected. And of course, the SA saw the army as being elitists and aristocrats, which they were. And this, of course, having the elites and aristocrats in power goes against their socialist ideas. And basically, after the Night of Long Knives, the army provided no opposition to Hitler as president. They could have thrown a wrench into his movement, declaring himself the Fuhrer, and instead they tacitly and then overtly approved it with the personal oath. So the army, the military, was one of the most important conservative elements and institutions that Hitler would have to reach some sort of accommodation with to maintain, to consolidate his rule. And there were other conservative elements. As we know from our discussion of Spain and Italy and Russia, what some of these other elements are, and the two are German industry and the religious institutions. So in the first one, he starts winning the German industry over, actually from near the beginning of the Great Depression, because of the quote unquote solutions, or the indication that they had solutions to fix some of these economic problems. But as they became more closely allied with the conservative nationalist party within the Reichstag, that brought some industrialists to their corner. And, of course, with the Night of Long Knives, Hitler demonstrates unequivocally that he is an enemy of socialism, which the industrialists also do not enjoy socialism. And so that shows them that he instead is the ally of the industry. And after he comes to power, after 1934, we have consistent anti-socialist legislation. So the banning of the Communist Party, the arresting of the members, the banning of trade unions, etc., etc. So there's consistent anti-socialist legislation. And of course, in the subsequent years, we have this rearmament. And the industrial, sorry about that. So industry was to benefit greatly from rearmament, because rearmament is essentially heavy industry, and there's all of these various elements that tie into it. And so this meant, of course, that they were making some money. And the other is the religious institutions. And so in July 1933, as mentioned previously, they signed a concordat with the Catholic Church. And this basically meant that the church was able to maintain the traditional purview that it had in education and other kind of traditional privileges. And the church in Germany agreed that the priests would not become involved in any political affairs. So this essentially silenced the priests from overt political opposition to the regime. And then, of course, with the Protestant churches, namely the Lutheran Church, agreed to the setup of a Reich church. And this basically defanged the Lutheran Church and kind of took the control of the ideas of their adherents away from the church and placed it into the hands of the state. And so one of the things also to mention is in signing these and developing these beforehand, the Nazis had to take a step back from their anti-clerical position, soften their approach in order to get these organizations to agree. So, to what extent had Hitler consolidated power by the end of 1934? I'd like to point out that the date is in bold. And so one of the reasons why I point this out to you is to make sure that you limit information to 1934. Now, obviously, the information in this video ends at that point. But oftentimes on the exam, you can discuss beyond that point, and then that kind of indicates you don't understand the question. So make sure you look at the dates. It's important to look at how the state was organized around Hitler. And this, of course, is going to play into the domestic policies and the foreign policies. So in theory, the Third Reich was supposed to be a balance between the German state and the Nazi Party, right? Remember, the political party is essentially only to be, is supposed to be working to pass laws in the government. But membership in the party meant that you could hold certain positions within the state apparatus. Hitler did not create a whole new governmental or legal system. So in that way, it wasn't a complete revolution. However, with the passing of the law for the restoration of the civil service in April 1933, it said that only people of Aryan descent and citizens could be part of the civil service. So that includes all governmental positions, notaries, judges, teachers, professors at universities. Only those people, those jobs could only be held by members of the Aryan race, and eventually later on, people were forced to be members of the party as well. However, even though the Weimar structure and institutions were still in place, um, the most important positions within those organizations were held by Nazis, could only be held by Nazis. So the heads of ministries, the top judges, etc., etc. Ultimately, the surface of the institutions remain intact, which is something to consider when we start looking at the extent that totalitarianism was achieved. So, in looking at Nazi control of the state and the larger civil society, there are three main instruments of control. The first is the SS, which began as a subset of the SA in 1924 as Hitler's personal bodyguard. And it expanded as other Nazi officials had their own bodyguards as well. In 1929, it was taken over by Himmler, and he saw the SS as a way of developing a really powerful control system within the Nazi Party and then within Germany. And it essentially became it was a civilian police network that was run on military lines. And it enforced the law, but it was outside the law. That is, civilians couldn't use the law against the SS. And so eventually the SS is going to take over the running of the concentration camps. And because of its sort of like army organization and standardization, is able to create a really brutal system. By 1936, Himmler has brought all of the police forces within the various German states within the SS authority, as indicated by this diagram. And the purpose or the goals that the SS worked for was the protection of Germany from racial corruption. It was supposed to develop a fighting spirit amongst its members. It had complete loyalty to the German state, and it had absolute obedience only to the orders of the Fuhrer. So the only law that it recognized was the orders of Hitler. Another major arm of state control was the Gestapo. And the Gestapo was a special arm of the SS, as the previous diagram showed you. And basically, it was a nationwide organization, and the goal was to expose and remove enemies of the state. And the civilian police force was subject to its authority. And of course, there was no restriction to its powers. So there was a lot of torture. They could arrest and hold people indefinitely, and on any sort of suspicion. And this was one of the most feared aspects of the government by the civilian population, because of course they could arrest and interrogate and do anything, and there was no other recourse. However, it relied very much on the support of the people in order to function. It was never a very large organization the way that the secret police in the USSR worked. So it really relied on people reporting each other to be able to move against others. So its investigatory abilities were limited, but it needed the ordinary citizens to inform on other people. We also have the SD, which was essentially the intelligence organization. So it was part of the SS until 1939, and then it was moved to another arm of the government. And this was the information gathering, and it gathered information domestically as well as internationally, and then provided that information to other organizations within the Nazi Party. And essentially what we have here is an overlap between the party organizations and institutions. And the SS, Gestapo, and SD eventually come to dominate the regime and domestic and foreign policies. We've spoken before about the army in terms of Hitler's consolidation of power. But the army bears discussion again, because the army is one of the arms that is used to maintain state control. As you know, it does not matter whether it is a left regime or right regime. The army is always necessary to have support of in order to maintain control, because they have the guns. And if they don't support you, then they could potentially rise up against you. And so they swear a personal oath to the Fuhrer. Hitler has them swear a personal oath. And the army was actually okay with this because it actually gave them a measure of independence away from the Nazi Party. So it's not the state that controls the military. The only individual who could gainsay the army's orders would be Hitler himself. And this actually places the army outside of the internal politics. And Hitler needed, however, Hitler needed the army to be less politically independent. Keep in mind that when we're talking about the army in this case, we are talking about the heads of the army, right? The guys who are the real decision makers. And the vast majority of officers were the elites. They were still largely dominated by the Prussian aristocracy. And in no way, shape, or form did the Prussian aristocracy respect this dude who was Austrian and never moved beyond the rank of private when he was in the army. So Hitler is going to need to control the army, the military, more fully. And it wasn't until 1938 does two sex scandals hand him the opportunity to do so. One was that one of the field marshals, that is one of the high up generals, his new wife was rumored to be a lady of the night. The second was a manufactured scandal about homosexuality for another commander-in-chief. And so essentially, Goering is going to exploit these two scandals. And in 1938, Hitler is named the commander-in-chief. This is not an honorary title like, hey, dude, yeah, you're the commander-in-chief. But it means that he is directly going to be directing the activities of the military. And this is going to be important when we look at World War II. And so this being named commander-in-chief directly increased the power he had and further consolidated his rule. Which brings us to look at the direct organization and the idea of working toward the Fuhrer. Hitler was not terribly interested in direct involvement in running the state. He wasn't there day to day at all. As long as people weren't Jews and they said that they supported the state, the institutions were left alone and the civil servants who were there previously were left in place. If he needed something particular done, he would create an organization or an agency with special powers to make that happen. Which meant that there was quite a lot of overlap, as we stated previously, between these organizations, because what may have been the traditional purview of one organization, when he decides he wants something done, he creates a special office for it, and now there are two organizations who may be working on the same thing. And so he would appoint ministers and he kind of left them to it. And this meant that the ministers had a lot of personal power. And this gave them a lot of room for initiative to do whatever it is that they wanted. And so this created a lot of rivalry between them, and which essentially meant that as they were in competition with each other, they weren't forming factions to work against Hitler. Now, because Hitler wasn't there very much, and he set up these overlapping ministries, and you have this rivalry between the ministers. This meant that the people were constantly working towards the Fuhrer. And this idea is that they would make their judgments based on what Hitler had said in the past. So their policies were what they thought Hitler might want. And so this meant that sometimes the policies became, well, not sometimes, often, the policies pushed further and further and further to the extreme. And the part you guys have all been waiting for. So here it goes. So if you ever get cold, go and stand in a corner. Why, you might ask? Because they're usually about 90 degrees.